welcome, subscribers. A warm welcome. Thank you for tuning in, and thank you for being here. We are continuing our excellent program with David Wilcock. Fascinating discussion here continues. And, you know, to begin this segment here, I would like just to comment and backtrack a little bit and say that, you know, so fascinating to hear all the scientific background that you've been, you know, sharing with us here, and that this kind of incorporates the spiritual aspect and also takes it away from the kind of, I guess, a little bit from the magical level and takes it into a very, you know, real thing, so to speak, that we actually can understand in a totally different way. What I would like to ask you is basically, I can see now why, you know, you've teamed up with Richard Hoagland a little bit, because I think your work kind of dovetails here. It feels like, in a way. I don't know if this is the case or you know, but you know.
His original book, Monuments of Mars, I got in 1993 after hearing about his presentation at the United Nations, and that really started me off on this what he calls hyperdimensional physics, where he's describing how, like, if you look at Jupiter with the Great Red Spot, 19.5 degrees below the equator on all these planets and the sun, you see these energetic phenomena. Like, you get Hawaii on Earth, these volcanic mountains. You get the largest volcano on Mars is at 19.5. You get cloud bands on Saturn. You get the Great Red Spot on Jupiter. You get the Great Dark Spot on Neptune. You get sunspots that don't go higher than 19.5 on the sun. So for years, I was once I started to put all this research together, I was trying to capture his attention. I started participating in his discussion group in 1996. I finally got his email address in 2000, and by 2001 we were in fairly regular communication. Then in 2003 we actually made our affiliation with each other public for the first time by co-authoring a paper on interplanetary climate change, showing that what's happening on the Earth with global warming is a phenomenon occurring throughout the solar system. What he's working on right now is really fascinating, insofar as he has published a book called Dark Mission, which is talking about NASA actually being a defense agency of the government, not just an exploration agency. It's actually chartered as a defense agency. And it also says that anything that is deemed to be inimical to the security of the United States is kept secret in NASA. So that includes the Roswell crash. Well, he doesn't go into UFOs, I do, but the Roswell crash, and then also if there's any ruins on other planets. So Richard's focus has always been on extraterrestrial ruins that can be photographed and studied. And most of the time he's focused on Mars, and there's some very interesting things on Mars, as you probably well know. But this particular book talks about what typically look like very large, very ancient glass structures on the moon. So you could argue, for example, that if you wanted to colonize the moon, you would build a giant glass dome so that it held in an atmosphere. And then inside that glass dome, you could grow plants, you could, you know, have buildings, and people could walk around without spacesuits on. The whole key is to keep building these glass domes that will hold the atmosphere. Well, what if that civilization was so old that in the meantime you've had all these little micrometeorites that have beat up these domes and there's nothing left inside or outside because the domes have cracked and all the moon dust has gotten in there and covered up all the stuff that was in there. But as a result of how transparent the glass is, it's very difficult to see that the domes are still there. It appears that NASA was well aware that these domes existed, and that most of the Apollo landing sites were intended to be located right near these domes. And yet they're so difficult to see just with the naked eye anyway that they didn't really show up very well in the photographs. But NASA would go a step further and then blot out the glass so that you couldn't see it in the images. And this is where Ken Johnston comes into play. Ken Johnston was working for NASA in the early 70s, and he worked for them during the Apollo missions as well. And one day he was given an order to destroy about 11 or 12 file cabinets worth of original photographs from the moon. They had 5 sets of photographs. This is from all the Apollo missions that walked on the moon, from 8 or 9 up until, I guess, 16 or something, 17.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know the exact numbers, but somewhere around that number. And this was, an enormous number of photographs that they said destroy them. And so he actually felt it was a travesty and saved one set of photographs. Now think about it. If you were going to go back and alter the originals, you wouldn't want there to be extra copies of the unaltered version. You'd want to only have your altered photographs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So Johnston saved these photographs and kept them in very good condition. And what happens is that when you start analyzing these photographs and then use very simple things in Photoshop that nobody could have imagined we would have had back then, you start finding all this stuff that shouldn't be there. These little things that you almost can't even see in the photograph, but when you amp up the contrast and the brightness, all of a sudden, man, what is that?
They're still there, yeah.
Oh, yeah. So Richard has teamed up with his colleague Mike Barra from lunaranomalies.com. They wrote this book, Dark Mission, primarily as a result of the incredible support from the Coast to Coast AM audience from George Norrie's radio show. It's propelled the book into bestseller status on New York Times, and it's been number 21 for at least 2 weeks in a row on there. So it's getting attention. He also recently had a conference in the National Press Club, which is the most prestigious press organization in the United States, where all the world's media converge on very important events. And what was so fascinating was that the Russian media showed a very strong interest in this.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
So they came with their cameras, and all the major television networks covered it on their news programs. He's got front-page stories on Russian newspapers. Russian R&D websites are talking about it. They're calling it NASA's moon crisis. Russia appears to be, well, they don't appear to be, they are saying that they're going to go back to the moon. They're teaming up with India.
Yeah.
And they're working together to go back to the moon. Now, Russia had originally invited the U.S. to go, and we turned them down for reasons that were never explained. So it seems very likely that Russia wants to go back there to be able to explore these ruins.
Do you get the feeling that that is the consensus, and that is why Russian media is so interested in it, or is it more, again, a kind of very sensation, oriented thing?
It's difficult to say. There is circumstantial evidence that Putin himself is responsible for this happening. But again, it's circumstantial, so it could be that it has nothing to do with him. It is true that, like, Pravda is a relatively major media organ in Russia, and that they fairly frequently cover all sorts of New Age metaphysical things.
Sure.
In general, the U.S. is probably one of the most backwards countries in the world in terms of totally denying the metaphysical and the spiritual from its media. The Russians are more open-minded, as are many other countries. We don't really know, but it does seem that the sheer intensity with which they've grabbed the story, how much they're promoting the story, the amount of coverage that he's getting, the films, the documentaries they're doing, they've actually flown out to film him again for another major news show. They're really not going to leave this alone. And it's going to be very interesting because sooner or later it's going to create enough political pressure that it should help usher in a disclosure. And that would be a really phenomenal thing to happen.
Yeah, there are so many nations now. There is kind of, again, looking at the moon, and it, it's, you were speaking about cycles earlier in the first segment, and
right.
One tends to wonder, okay, we were there in 69 and a few years, beyond that, but then for some reason nothing happens, at least not in the official, scene, so to speak. But now people are looking at it again, or China is looking at it, India and Russia, as you say, the U.S. want to go back again, and Japan is sending probes up there to photograph and stuff. Is this something to do with the cycles, or have there had this other space program going all of this time to actually explore stuff on the moon? But we hear nothing about it,
Well, there's a lot of legends that suggest very strongly that the last major technological civilization on Earth, which some people call Atlantis, there was actually more than one civilization. There was Atlantis and there was Rama, which was the one focused in India. That they warred with each other and they had colonized the moon. Some of the Atlantean memory of that is preserved in the Tibetan scriptures. There's Tibetan scriptures that very clearly describe what appear to be spacecraft and very clearly describe, moon exploration and bases on the moon and so forth. So it appears that the Atlanteans had mastered anti-gravity, among other things. And once you start using anti-gravity propulsion, it becomes very easy to travel outside the Earth and go to Mars or go to the moon or whatever. The glass that you would build these domes out of is very easily mined from the lunar soil, because the lunar soil is essentially, all you have to do is a very mild amount of processing on it, and you can get glass right out of it. So it's easy to build. And also because the gravity is a lot lower, it doesn't take as much energy to hold up. You can build a much larger structure and not worry about it falling over. And glass actually, in terms of its strength, is actually stronger than steel when you start getting into the larger structures and building pylons out of glass and so forth. It's very, very strong.
Really?
Oh, yeah.
So do you, personally believe or have theories about that this is traces of humans being up there, or is this, E.T.?
Yeah, in fact, what I've already said is probably more speculative than what Richard would be willing to go public with. But yeah, it is definitely my belief that the ancient civilization of Atlantis was real. I mean, it's funny because if you go back to that chapter in Shift of the Ages I was telling you about on my website, divinecosmos.com, in that chapter, you will see coverage from BBC, coverage from National Geographic, mainstream media organs describing pyramids, Stonehenge, buildings, roads, under the sea around Cuba. See, this is what they do. They put the stuff out there just enough that they won't get caught with their pants down in the event that it gets disclosed in the future. They can say, no, we talked about it right here. But then they never really promote it. They just put a little thing out on the net, and it rises and it falls and it's gone. Nobody pays attention. So again, this area around Cuba couldn't have been above ground earlier than probably 12,000 years ago. And yet there is very clear evidence of volcanic ash that they found and things that would indicate that the structures had to be above water. So the point is, all the evidence is there. Anybody who says that these ancient civilizations didn't exist is simply turning their head from the evidence. And then when you consider the fact that these guys obviously had to have some levitation technology, there's no way you can manipulate pieces of granite of this size where you're dealing with multi-ton blocks. There's no crane in the world that's large enough to be able to lift these blocks right now. There has to be some sort of technology that nullifies gravity. And as soon as you accept that, as soon as you accept that they could levitate blocks, why couldn't they levitate a ship right on out of the Earth's atmosphere into space?
Sure, exactly.
So it becomes pretty darn obvious that there's a lot more going on than we've been told. And the other countries, honestly, as far as I can tell, are frustrated, and they don't want to play the game anymore. They're ready for the disclosure to be over. They're ready to have the truth come out. And the real defining moment is going to be video footage of an astronaut in front of a big structure that shouldn't be there on the moon. That's what we're waiting for. It may never happen because 2012 may happen sooner, but I think there's a lot of surprises that are in store for us between now and 2012. I don't think we've seen the end by any stretch. I think there's a lot of things coming down.
What do you mean by that we might not see it because 2012 happened before that time? What do you mean by that?
Well, it takes a long time to do a moon mission.